Damaged Defenders by Scheherazade. Chapter 64. Steve. Academically and intellectually, Steve knew he was a mess right now. Mostly, though, he really didn't care about academics or intellect right at the moment. He was too busy trying to deal with the emotional end of things. His emotions were all over the place. One moment, he felt like curling up into the tiniest ball humanly possible and crying his heart out. The next, it was all he could do to keep himself from storming out of the tower in search of a target he could rip to shreds in rage. Others, he was all but paralyzed by grief and horror. Not to mention the, as Charles had put it, whiny teenager part of him that kind of just wanted people to go away and let him do all of that in peace. To not remind him he had responsibilities of any kind. At the same time, that self-same responsible leader part of him had made a point of poking at him and reminding him he did indeed need to, go be a leader. And as much as a part of him didn't want to, he'd acknowledged Charles' points and more or less forced himself into that mode. It helped that forcing himself to think tactically and as a leader muted the rest, at least for now. Though he really didn't know what to think of Charles' request that he go talk to Magneto. Steve understood that someone with that kind of power on their side would be an asset. And he was even sympathetic to the damage that had to have been done to the man physically and mentally surviving the camps. But at the same time, he'd gone and done some really horrible things. So we'd have to really think about trying to approach the guy. Then again, it might just be the best idea. As bad as this fight was probably going to get, Steve wasn't going to bet on Magneto staying wherever he'd been put. The odds of the place taking damage enough that Magneto could get out were pretty good. Better, in that case, to at least try to talk the guy into being a decent person. Steve shoved those thoughts away. He'd deal with the Magneto problem a little later. Okay, I have some questions, he said. Frigga, do you have any idea what sort of force we're looking at?
Frigga shook her head. Heimdall watches, but the enemy does not march in ordered ranks, which makes counting their numbers all but impossible. All he can say for certain is that there is but one, albeit massive, ship proper in Thanos' army, probably carrying him. Aside from that, there are many thousands, perhaps even millions, of the large armored flyers that I believe you have taken to calling space whales. How many they carry, we do not know.
We'll have an answer for that soonish, Tony said. The ones that managed to make it here during the invasion were all cut into parts to be dissected and examined. It won't be all that long before we have a carrying capacity and all that jazz. Steve nodded. That's good to know. Anything else coming at us? And any guesses as to the size of the ship?
Frigga actually grimaced a bit, which surprised Steve. An innumerable host of the smaller three-man sleds, she said. As for the size of the ship...
She frowned for a moment, evidently trying to translate measures in her head.
Roughly the size of 3 or 4 of your largest seagoing ships put together, I believe.
Ouch. Not good, Tony said. Tony? Steve asked. He had no idea how big ships were these days. Well, let me put it this way. The largest seagoing ship ever built, that we know of for sure, was the Seawise Giant. She was 1,500 feet long and 225 wide, Tony told him. Steve grimaced. 3 of those put together was a bit on the big side. He glanced over at Frigga. That sound about right?
As close as I can be sure of, Frigga said. Heimdall has only been able to guess at the ship's size, as there is little other than the space whales to compare it to.
Fair enough, Steve said. Next question. Do you have any idea of Thanos' abilities?
He is intelligent in the extreme, Frigga said. Of old, he was capable of many powers of the mind, such as telepathy and telekinesis. Those powers were supposedly stripped from him when he was banished. Whether they were just not successfully removed or he regained them somehow, I do not know. Beyond that, he was durable and strong on a level that made even the Nidavellir seem as newborn babes. What powers and abilities he has now, I cannot say.
Yeesh. As bad as Steve had figured the fight was going to be, it was sounding like it would actually be worse. Well, nothing for it. It was either defeat Thanos, soundly, or no more Earth. Gotcha. Well, at least we have somewhere to start anyway, Steve told her, then glanced at Tony. Tony, how long will you need to work up schematics for that arm? His voice got a little tight at the last word of that sentence because he was trying very hard not to think about who the arm would be going on, because if he thought about that, he'd be right back to wanting to cry or kill someone. Tony turned to Frigga and started asking questions of his own. These, though, were about Asgard metalworking facilities. Steve was pleased with himself when he was able to follow most of that discussion. While there was no chance in heck he'd understand most of the stuff Bruce and Jane talked about anytime soon, he wasn't dumb, but it would take him time to understand that stuff. Most of what Tony did, Steve could follow. He didn't have a chance in heck of doing about 99% of what Tony did, but he at least understood a lot of it when Tony talked about it. With schematics of the original to work with and the stuff I've done for the suit, it'll only take me a couple of days at most to get something worked out and the electronics programmed. Tony told him, I'll want to bring metals from Earth just in case, and definitely the electronics that'll go into the arm, but I could do the actual building of the arm in Asgard. Steve nodded. Okay. He went quiet for a minute, chewing on the information he'd been given and trying to work up some sort of plan and timeline to get things done. After a minute, he nodded. So, here's a plan. Once we're done here, Charles and Loki head downstairs to have a chat with that beloved woman. Jarvis, he glanced up as he called that name, can start tracking down mentions of containers of power and their last known locations, so we at least have somewhere to start looking for that and track down information on... He joked on the actual words. On who did that to Barnes and where they are now. Tony finished for him. Steve shot him a grateful look. Yeah, that... You, he nodded to Tony, can work on the arm for the next few days, and in between bouts of that, you, Thor, Loki, and I can go over the stuff dealing with the heads of the other realms, their cultures, and all of that. Once the schematics are ready, the entire team plus Cecilia and Hank head for Asgard. From there, we can try a meet and greet with Hulk. Depending on how that goes, we either table working with him for later or jump right in and start training. Steve said. Wait, add Charles to the list if we're going to work with Hulk. He'll be able to tell us just how much Hulk understands, which will reduce problems on that end, at least. Tony said. Oh, and Betty. She'd be thoroughly pissed at us if we did this without her on hand. Steve blinked, then nodded. Right, yeah, good idea. I don't really think he'll be a problem. He sure didn't give us any grief during the fight, but the less we irritate him, even by accident, the better. And Betty has said she can get him to behave without a problem, so if things go awry for some reason, we'd need her. From the expression on Charles' face, he definitely wasn't going to quibble about the opportunity to go to another world. Not that Steve really blamed him. Despite the reason they'd gone to Asgard, even Steve had been more than a little excited about the whole alien world in space thing. We let Tony build the arm and have the Asgardian medics do the switch with Hank and Cecilia on hand for any problems. As well as get the rest of the crap out of where it didn't belong. But the less Steve thought about that, the better. Then Tony, myself, and either Thor, Loki, or both do a tour of the realms to talk to the leaders. I want to go to Svartalfheim first. Steve told them. He nodded at Frigga. You said they'd be the best to go to for spaceships of our own, right?
Yes, they would.
Frigga confirmed. Right, so the sooner we talk to them and negotiate that, the better. Whoever ends up crewing the things will need time to learn how to do that, after all. Steve reasoned. While he hoped Loki would go to all the realms with them, he rather thought Loki would skip out the Jotunheim visit, which would probably end up being a good thing if his reaction to Farbati was anything to go by. Not that Steve really blamed the guy, but that kind of... Well, there really wasn't any other way to call it except see the hatred. Did not make for good or peaceful meetings. Oh, speaking of meetings... Tony, did you ever talk to Fury about officially warning the planet's governments that Thanos and the Chitauri were coming? Tony looked blank for half a second before cursing quietly. No, I forgot about that. I'll do it yet tonight. Jarvis, do not let me forget about that. I will ensure you are reminded, sir, Jarvis said. Don't worry about it too much, Tony. It's not like we've exactly had a nice, easy, peaceful time the last couple weeks. And that's without having to run a company on top of everything else that's been going on. Steve told him. That's the immediate stuff. We also need to train, with or without Hulk, depending on how he reacts to the Asgard attempt. And I'd really like to train at least a little with the X-Men, Steve told him. Not that I object, but may I ask why? Charles asked. I'm thinking your people and the Avengers will probably form the main direct attack on Thanos himself. The other teams will be needed to keep things to a dull roar with the Chitauri. Speaking of, when you talk to that Shiro fella, Loki, make sure you talk him into protecting more than just Japan. I remember Tony saying that China and India are the most heavily populated spots on the planet. I figure we'll need Shiro's group and whoever Mikhail pulls together to work that area. Plus whoever else we can get into workable teams, whether from the realms or Earth. Which is another point. We're going to have to arrange tours of Earth and the solar system like Frigga mentioned when we talk to the realm's leaders. Though how we're going to organize the space end of the fight, I haven't figured yet. I mean, I trust the individual leaders to deal with their people, but we're going to have 6 groups of ships under 6 leaders up there, and a whole lot of territory to cover, which has the potential to be a real mess unless the leaders work it out beforehand. Steve blew out a breath. Yeah, they had a lot to do before Thanos showed up. I also want to meet the folks you talked about, Charles. At least with the Europe and North America groups, we're going to have to iron out who covers what areas so no one gets confused. And introduce them to their outworld help and let everyone get used to each other. Which means we'll need to meet with the Earth folks before the Realm folks get their tour of Earth proper. That way, as we're showing them around, we can introduce them to the folks who will be acting as their leaders due to familiarity with the territory. Steve wound down and mentally counted items off, trying to make sure he hadn't missed anything. Like he told Tony, things had been a little nuts the last couple weeks. I think that's everything, he said after a few moments, then quirked a half smile. Though with our luck, we'll be getting stuff dropped in our laps unexpectedly along the way. I fear I already have a new item to add to the list of things to do, Jarvis said. Miss Ross contacted a friend of hers in the mental health profession, and he has recommended someone with several years of experience working with combat veterans and ex-prisoners of war. I have examined his available online file, and believe he would be a good fit to work with not only Sergeant Barnes, but the rest of the team as well. Tony shot the ceiling a glare that rather amused Steve for reasons he couldn't immediately identify. Oh, really? Yes, he is a combat veteran himself, honorably discharged several years ago after the death of his wingman. After dealing with that loss, he became a counselor himself, and has been working in various VA centers on a volunteer basis. Miss Ross's friend, I believe the expression is, felt him out, and he is amenable to working with a specific group full-time, though the details of who exactly he'd potentially be working with were not included in the discussion. Steve gagged his head. Sounds pretty good, actually, he admitted. So, add interviewing him with an eye to hiring him onto the list? And what's his name? Samuel Wilson.